There's your handsome face.
Hey, how's it going?
Yeah, good, good, good. All right. What are 6 months?
I mean, yeah, but when you compare it to the previous 6 months and the 6 months before that, I don't know. It seems pretty mellow.
Right.
Almost a sedative half a year.
Yeah, quite peaceful, really. Amazing. Cool. All right. What else do I need to tell people before we start? I've got the questions on the iPad. It was the Q&A rules chat. Nothing else. No other rules we've invented for this annual tradition or biennial tradition. No, half yearly.
So is it
tradition.
Bi or semi-annual? I was thinking.
Biennial is every.
I was literally thinking about that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we'll just say half yearly, like it's a sale.
Yeah, so I was going through it, and I think this will be our 12th time doing this.
Yeah.
Because we did one in 2015, right?
Yes.
Okay. So maybe it's either the 12th or the 13th.
Right. So it might be the lucky 13th NASA sign episode. All right, cool. All right. So, I mean, as we usually do with these 6 month, well, actually, we were talking about it before we hit record. And what's emerged out of this 12, possibly 13 discussion project or experience or ceremony so far is quite a long meditation on meditating on longer cycles, right? And I mean, in particular, one of the things I know we're both most proud of is putting some quite deep discussion around the triplicity change, which is very long, right? And so like discussing, because I know sometimes, exciting things happen and I'm like, no, we won't break the tradition. We'll do it every 6 months. That's how it works, because it sort of forces us to look at epochal shifts and longer changes, doesn't it?
It does. And it's the longer cycles, but it's also, should we say, nestling, Russian doll style cycles inside one another, right? Like, I think we've done a lot. I'd like to think we've done a pretty good job of looking at something that happens in a given month where it's like, oh, this is a good thing. This is like a very positive short cycle, but it's nestled within this longer cycle that has a different story, right? It's something can be a high point in a happy story, and or it could be a high point in a bummer of a story, or the reverse. It could be a low point in a happy story. And that's really that is the literal structure of the astrological method, right? Is to look at which cycles fit inside of other cycles, and we've got all those different hands on the clock.
Yes, I like that. And one of the things that certainly emerged over it, that's just sort of an extension of that, or emerged as part of the process, is I've brought a improving understanding of like Armstrong's model and other ones and other like economic cycle models. Is we were talking before that the overlap appears to be greater at longer cycles, right? So if I look at what you can use Socrates for to day trade, and I look at people who use astrology to day trade, there's very little overlap between them. And it's that sort of idea of pixelating the more you zoom in, but the more you zoom out, waves kind of look very similar. And there's some very interesting stuff in the coming 6 months and nested.
Well, let me just pause you for a second and jump in on that. As you say that, it occurs to me that big stuff is probably going to be detectable by more methods, right? Just like, sure. Whether using, eyesight or sound or sonar or radio waves to like find out where things are. Things that are, truly massive are going to show up on virtual, like through all sorts of different detection methods. Whereas like, using the eyeballs and using the ears, for little things, you might hear something that you can't see and vice versa.
Yeah, that's, it's actually how I sold or described Socrates and Armstrong's work to my father, who actually, well, he doesn't day trade, but he invests, and he has his self-managed superannuation fund, which is like our pensions and whatever. And I said, you don't need a $200 million AI that you've built yourself to know that we're in an inflationary uptrend, right? Like, yeah, because it's big, like anyone can kind of see that, or that we're in a declining in confidence in government downtrend. Like, you don't need it, but when you have that, you can actually, and it's to your point that, well, I've got eyes, so I don't need I don't need a different model or a different framework or system for looking at it. And that's true. That's a good way of realizing that the further back you step, there's going to be more alignment between systems, and that's useful, I think.
Yeah, big stuff is loud on every level.
Yes. Awesome. All right. Well, speaking of loud and speaking of longer cycles, I guess, weird segue, or clunky. How do you think we went? Let's do the 6-month review, the first half of 2021. And we, again, discussing beforehand, what do you think the standout configuration was there?
Well, I was thinking about this earlier, and really there were kind of two big delineations, or, sets of expectations. One, good, one not so good. The good was the movement of Jupiter into Pisces and a couple weeks of pretty relatively friendly skies. That was mid-May. That kind of gave us mid-May through first part of June. And that stacked up with a lot of the world, not all of the world, pretty well. Like in America, that's when everybody was, ripping their masks off and running around naked outside. Like there was a very dramatic, almost, what's the word, disorienting opening. And so, yeah, that was nice as expected. And then, the bummer one, which is unfortunately still relevant, was the very beginning of the year. And that was the January 6th ingress of Mars into Taurus. And what I said was that we've got this Saturn Uranus square, which is really the configuration for all of 2021 and 2022. And that would really light up whenever Mars was configured to it. And that was the Mars's ingress into Taurus, where Uranus is, was the first lighting up from Mars. That was the first time Mars, hit fired up the old combustion engine. And, that couldn't have been, how should we say, easier in retrospect. Like, oh, this, kind of chaotic, destabilizing period where there will be challenges to authority and whatnot starts on January 6th. So that one worked out.
Yeah, and I think that was the best double hit too, because that was a major Socrates turning point, January 6th. And so I was looking at it from that direction. And then, yeah, it even had the literal symbolism. So I think that gets, unless you can think of another one, as you say, Jupiter Pisces is nice, but I think that's the configuration of the half year, like in the sense.
Yeah, well, and unfortunately, sorry.
No, that's it.
I was just saying, unfortunately, the Jupiter in Pisces isn't the backbone configuration of this year and next.
No,
right? It was like a little mercy, little celestial, a slight reprieve.
Which is one of the things I wanted to talk about at some point. Just from a medicinal perspective, is if you are in a situation to enjoy it, because, and I discussed it at the beginning of the year, so it's not and it'll be the subject of discussion a little bit later on today. Next year is worse. It's a simple way of putting it. So if you can get some kind of fishy Jupiter, if you can get Jupiter fish on your fingers, do it. And kind of fill up on joy where and when you can, in like a camel sense, because there's
so within just a few days of Jupiter's ingress, I was unexpectedly invited out for like a day of wholesome fun on a lake. And so I found myself, I think it was like 4 days after Jupiter moved in, just like surrounded by, happy people and families doing like wholesome water sports. It's an important distinction. Exactly. And I was like, okay, yeah, like Jupiter's moved into Pisces, right? Like there's benefic in the water now.
Yeah, I remember that. That was cool. But yeah, anything else from H1 that would be a contender? The eclipses were what they were, although they're probably worth talking about. Anything else from H1 that's worth talking about?
I don't think that. I think those two standouts, like the little bit of mercy and the expected trouble, were probably the two standouts. Yeah, I mean, the eclipses were sort of intense to varied degrees. I don't think that one. I don't think these eclipses told an extremely broad, like, multinational story. I think if you if you have a planet in Gemini that's important, then that was intense for you, but that's a smaller story.
Yeah, definitely. That may change in H2, just looking, as we sort of discussed beforehand, and we'll certainly get to. But do we want to start talking about H2, or do we want to talk about H2 in the context of longer chunks of time? Do we want to, because sometimes you do the H and then we do the longer span, and other times we do the longer span and then the H. What do we want to do first?
Let's do the chunking up the decade part.
Excellent. So over to you, sir.
All right. So one of the things that's neat about Saturn's cycle is that it will divide up any 10 years, any span of 10 years, into 4 almost exactly equal portions, right? So it quarters a decade. And that's Saturn in a different sign for each of those quarters. Now, it just so happens that with this decade, we had Saturn's ingress into a sign a week and a half before 2021 started. And so the 2020s are very neatly divided into quarters. It's like quarters of a sports game of some sort. And we're 7 months into the first quarter, right? Which is 2.5 years. And that's the Saturn in Aquarius, Saturn square Uranus part, right? And all of these dynamics that we've already seen, again, they already got lit on fire by Mars's activation of that configuration in January. We're in the process right now in July of doing a second round of Mars lighting it up. We'll do a third, and most likely inarguably the most intense round in November this year. But we're going to be doing this story with variations for about another year and a half. Then we do 2.5 years of Saturn and Neptune in Pisces, very different. Then we do Saturn and Neptune in Aries, and then we finish out the decade with Saturn in Taurus. And so we have pretty neat division. And one thing that's especially interesting about this is that right at that halftime, there's a real show. There's the halftime show is that not only does Saturn move, but as I just mentioned, Neptune changes signs, which is only once every 14 years, at almost exactly the same time Saturn does. And Pluto changes signs. And Pluto has been in Capricorn since 2008. And Uranus changes signs, which is since 2018. That's in every 7 years. So you have in every 7 years, and every 2.5 years, and every 14 years. And then Pluto doesn't have a regular speed relative to us because the orbit's super elliptical. But in this case, it will have been about 17 years. So you have all of those changing right around the halftime show. Right. So
which is,
I would expect, what do they call it? A wardrobe malfunction?
Yeah. And so that halftime show, all those changeovers is when in the decade?
It's like 2025. It's the halftime show of the decade. It's not like the same day, but like if we're talking about decade-long cycles, it's one big show.
Yeah. Now, where that is, this is where, like, I can look at it again, the sort of longer cycle alignment stuff. The situation we're in at the moment is itself in a halftime moment, right? So at the beginning of last year, when we were talking about the triplicity change in data being the new oil, and then we had what happened in 2020, and from the very beginning of it, regardless of the health incident component, I'm like, well, this is a bulldozing of the real economy so it can be rebuilt in a permission-based system and leading to digital currency, and that's that. the vaccine passports and the rest of it. So the technological build out has happened, and the next half of it is how that gets implemented. So we're sort of there. There isn't a G20 country that isn't doing its own digital currency experimentation, and same thing from the passports perspective. So that's the second half of this game, which is also why next year is worse than like this, and even to some extent last year. There are other reasons which we'll get to, but that makes it a quarter of a Saturn decade. And the thing that happens after that, approximately, and because of it, is we're already experiencing dramatic inflation due to things like shortages, but the next round, the next sort of Saturn quarter, if we will, is extremely inflationary. So that's when a can of beans is $1, then $5, then $25, then there's no beans.
Well, that's really interesting. Let me frame some of this in terms of the astrology. So one of the key components of the Saturn-Uranus square is obviously Uranus. This is Uranus and Taurus. Uranus does 7-year arcs, right? So in this 7-year arc, which is the Taurus one, when you look back at it and you just look at the present, you get very meaningful disruptions of currency, goods and logistics, and labor, right? And currency is one way to describe a store of value, right? And so if we're just thinking about that, whatever Uranus has for us in Taurus this time, which seems pretty standard historically, but in our context, that has until about 2025 to play out. So that the Uranus and Taurus currency value disruption. And when I say disruption, it's important to not just think it's like things go down, right? Or things go up. Their Uranus brings volatility. A really good example of that is the GameStop thing, the GameStop and AMC thing, where values, were 10 times what anyone expected, and then they drop to a tenth of that. It's that, and to a certain degree, that's sort of the crypto story. But that's also, that's sort of coming for and intersecting with other currencies, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so that runs until exactly the halfway point, and it's very interesting to think that right now we have the Saturn square Uranus. So Saturn is responsible for management and security, right? It's keeping things organized. And so poor Saturn is driven mad by this volatility and these very fundamental Taurus earth element things. It's trying to figure out a way to systematize them, right? That's the first quarter. That's the one we're in. But after that, we've still got another, 2 years of Uranus and Taurus, right? Same set of volatilities. But then we will have Saturn, the comptroller, in Pisces with Neptune, right? And Neptune is Neptune is the most, how should we say, form averse, solidity averse planet. It's the all that is solid melts into multicolored neon fumes. Neptune, we can consider Neptune very helpful for dreaming stuff, for like big spiritual stuff. It's not helpful at all for the price of goods, right? And so what we have, and so that's very interesting, that we would be playing this money story through the Saturn, Neptune, and Pisces.
Absolutely. And there's more I want to say, because this I found very interesting on the Saturn in Pisces. And again, correct me because you're the man astrologer here. There is 2 components there that I think are very predictive and in alignment, which is that is a rationing of joy, which is very specifically when once we have the currency replacement tied to compliance in these apps that are complying with our movement. That means, and this is why they want it, you won't be able to do things based on compliance. That's one of the reasons they like the sort of contract-based digital currencies from an experimental perspective. So you have a rationing of joy, an orderly rationing of joy, but you also have a kind of restriction on things that bring them. And people don't kind of realize, and this is inflation related, and people don't realize where some of that will land as we move into the Aries part, which is the war. So I have my iPad next to me, and this is my GoPro on a little tripod in front of the Mac, which is running this. All three of these devices have microprocessors that are made in Taiwan, where 85% of the world's microprocessors are made. And Taiwan is in play. So when it comes to joy and restriction and rationing, as we move through the end of this process, this sort of initial build out of a new control grid, which will fail, but it will be a failure to watch. There are places where the story of the up and down of currency, the Uranus and Taurus mania aligns with
Uranus and Taurus, the currency manipulator.
Yeah, but with that overlaid with Saturn in Pisces is exactly again. So the second quarter lines up with, and again, kind of like you don't need Armstrong's AI to know that what happens at the end of this play out over the next 18 months is exactly what we've just described, which is widespread shortages, surprise shortages, and consequently inflation, and dramatic inflation because it's based on surprise shortages, right?
Well, and I would also add, even though they won't be noticed as much, there will probably be also completely surprising surpluses in areas as well, right? Like that's the Uranus thing. It's not just
that's true,
right? It's not just less than. If we just knew it was going to be less, it wouldn't be a surprise. It's that like you have twice as much of the twice as much of this as you actually need, and you have half as much of this.
I like it. Going on to quarter three, and we're all, by the way, people watching this, we're doing this because we need to be. We need to contextualize H2. Again, this is the story of longer cycles and so on.
So let me describe a little something that I think is really important about the Saturn Neptune in Pisces. And it's also, which is again, Q2 of the decade. And it's also important for the Saturn Neptune in Aries, which is Q3 of the decade. And that is that when we look at the 20th century and the Saturn Neptune conjunctions, which are every 36 years, tell the entire story of the Soviet project. Literally, the beginning of it is Saturn Neptune. The meaning Saturn Neptune conjunct. The very meaningful halfway point when Stalin dies, Saturn Neptune conjunct. And then the dissolution of the Soviet Union was Saturn Neptune conjunct, right? And this is not something that I figured out. This was a now deceased French astrologer whose name I can't remember offhand, but who predicted the dissolution of the Soviet Union in like the late 70s based on this cycle. And so where this will be the middle of this decade will be the first time that we've had Saturn Neptune conjunct for quite some time, like since the early 90s. And so what's interesting about the Saturn Neptune is it's not just like how should we say, it's not just like a boost for a collective project like the Soviet Union or just the failure, like literally the story of its beginning, middle, and then I don't know, end, at least end for then dream. Like that whole story is told like on that conjunction.
It's the dream of control. It's Neptune and Saturn. It's perfect.
Yeah, I would say it's their dreams of and so what's interesting, right, is it's Saturn, it's Saturn hanging out with the planetary master of the dreaming, right? And so you also have dreams of compassion, right? Like it's the like, what if everybody had enough, right? That was certainly motivating for a lot of people, and because Neptune is soft and compassionate, but in a non-boundaried way, where it's like never okay enough for everybody. And from for people who have Neptune strongly placed in their natal charts, there's often a huge amount of sympathy, which can get them into trouble, right? Because if you ponder deeply everyone's suffering, there's always more suffering. There is a blood ocean. And so, it's a thing.
Interesting. And so do we, off the top of your head, do you know when that conjunction exactly is in the second quarter of the Saturn decade?
It's I want to say 24. It's at the very end of Pisces. See,
Okay.
they catch each other at the very end and then both pop over into Aries together. Right. And the it is important and useful to look at, the exact day when the planets are perfectly aligned, but simply sharing the same sign, that same
Yes.
wedge of the sky, commingles their energies, and creates a period of time.
Yes. Yeah.
It's the metaphor, like the in tradition metaphor, is that they're living in the same house, right? They may not be on top of each other. They may not be sitting on each other's lap on the couch, but like they're roommates, and so they're constantly affecting one another.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That's really so. Where that gets interesting, obviously, Aries, war, etc. Saturn moving into Aries. At the end of this attempted technocratic reorganization of G7 and this sort of build out of a global digital currency, which is what G7 and WEF and everyone has been announcing and writing books about, which doesn't appear to work looking at the models. Socrates has the beginning of the risk of world war from 2024, starting no later than 2027. And that's kind of interesting because that's the third quarter of the Saturn.
Yeah, well, and I'm certainly not predicting a world war,
No.
but if we're looking at like periods that are much more ripe for conflict, Saturn, Neptune, and Aries, Neptune is Aries, we can call that Mars dreaming, right, or war dreaming, right? Like the natural, to a certain degree, the sign that Neptune is in, you can see sort of, we call it dreaming trends for 14 years at a time. You can actually follow pretty well what drugs are popular for about a decade and a half. Neptune in Sagittarius, for example, when I was born, I believe you as well, that was the heyday of cocaine, which makes perfect sense if you've ever met a Sagittarius. Neptune in Capricorn.
Say you've ever spent several days up on cocaine, or if you've ever met a Sagittarius.
But anyway, so it's just like, it's one of the things drugs do is they put us in a very particular trance, right? And Neptune in Pisces puts us in a particular trance. It's been a trance of, I would say in many ways, like deep compassion and sadness, but also magic, and reopened a lot of people's minds to like the great reality of how mysterious and powerful and exciting the universe is, but matched with that deep sadness as well. Neptune in Aries is a different thing, right?
Uranus is in Gemini by then?
Uranus movement into Gemini is the halftime show, or is one of the acts in the halftime show. And just while we're doing like long cycle stuff, there's almost nothing more important in the history of the United States than Uranus and Gemini. So Uranus and Gemini the first time, Declaration of Independence. Uranus in Gemini the second time, Civil War. Uranus and Gemini the third time, World War II. Right? It's just like it's a huge before and after in every case. Yeah. And so that's a really critical, I guess the positive language would be that's a rebirth period for the United States. But some of those rebirths were pretty those were not easy labors.
And wait till we get to the fourth Saturn quarter, right? But why I think that's relevant when we're talking about, because neither am I predicting, but again, you only need to, not that you should ever do this at the moment, but you only need to turn on mainstream news to be quietly confident that international conflict between superpowers is escalating. So it's not even like it's a woolly prediction, much like the rest of them. It's actually just putting this framework suggests if it's going to happen, it's going to be now, rather than we're predicting world war. And we'll get to how we use the kind of dire frameworks, but I want to come back more beforehand.
Yeah.
I need
the
to do
rhetoric
Uranus
is at
Gemini
least
bit.
escalating.
I need to do my Uranus and Gemini bit because I think that might be, if we're looking for good news, the release valve for the risk of war, because what you have there, which is already going on, but certainly when you're dealing with a war with someone like China, you have two incommensurate, incandescent liars in the form of the United States and China. And you were basically in a surprise war of reality. Like, you know, it's not just hacking, although it is that. It is 3D deep fakes. It is all this kind of stuff, weather warfare, all these things, anything but what looks like a traditional war beforehand. And so when we look at how Uranus has been so transformative moving through Taurus, and then when we get to there, you're dealing with like just pure cyberpunk and bigger possibilities at that point. So it's funny, I look at that as it's true from a US perspective, particularly for the fourth Saturn decade, but my hope is that the kind of Saturn in all the kind of war dreaming that is associated with it has a release valve, because there will be an opportunity, and this is really Chinese, of course, like to go to war without going to war. And so I'm kind of hoping we just get a reality war rather than a war.
And what does meaningful conflict look like? In the second half of the 2020s, right? We have, from a military perspective, we have this whole digital theater, which actually has many I'm not knowledgeable enough to figure it out, but I'm sure that you could probably break down the digital theater into like a land, sea, and air version or something like that, like meaningful different terrains within a digital theater.
Yeah, I like it. Was there something you wanted to say before I lost my Uranus and Gemini thought?
Oh, no, not really.
Yeah, cool. Because it's interesting that Uranus and Gemini being important for the US, the final Saturn decade, or Martin Armstrong has famously 2032 as the end of, it's the movement of the financial capital of the world to Beijing from the US. And that's, again, there's about 5 or 6 different models: Kondratiev waves, westward movement of capital, rise and fall of empires. There are this kind of clock of the sort of power and money capital of the world moving in a westward direction has happened since Babylon. It moved through Europe, and then it moved across the Atlantic to the US, and then it went from the east to the west coast of the US, and it's in the process now of jumping the Pacific, right? And it will do that.
Yeah, well, as I've said before, if you study China from like from through last couple of thousand years, whenever China was relatively internally coherent and unified, it was incredibly powerful. It's a huge amount of people. There are a lot of resources. The last 100 and let's say 70, 80 years of Chinese history have been a real bummer for China and the Chinese people. And just China getting up to sort of average strength historically, kind of displaces the balance of power in the rest of the globe. That said, I think it's very important that as we're like thinking, like seeing how these changes might occur, that we don't project an idea of like America in the 1990s superpower onto like a very powerful, a financially powerful Beijing. Like, I don't think we're just gonna, it's not that, China does America in the 90s. Like, we have only so many lived examples of what a superpower looks like. And I think it's really easy to project like the last one on to the next one.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm very specific that I say that the financial capital moves to Beijing rather than China, because this Saturn decade that we're talking, it doesn't all go China's way, right? So I actually would not be surprised if we close out the decade with the Chinese borders looking very different to what they do now. Beijing will still exist in the same way, New York does or whatever. And I agree completely. So it's not just that China, as we understand it, becomes America in the 90s is really important. It will not.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I really want to step back and then nestle this into the age of air, right? Mm-hmm. Which is like this is the first, what,
Oh yeah,
we're talking about the first 10 of roughly 200 years.
yeah,
And so historically, the pattern of the age of air is, how should we say, devolution of power rather than centralization of power.
yeah.
Right? It doesn't mean that no centralized power is allowed to exist for 200 years, but in general, like when you look at some of the even the the great empire of the last age of air was the Khans after the Mongol conquest, but those very quickly divided and very quickly turned against each other in many cases. There wasn't like one giant thing. There may have been alliances, but it wasn't. It was in no way the same as like the Roman Empire, where everything is under one one imperial thumb, or any of these like several hundred years, all this territory hangs together, right? Where there's a tendency for things to fragment into khanates during the age of air. Same thing happened with Alexander, right? Alexander conquered all this immediately. It fractures or just naturally divides into whatever you call those the four different divisions of the empire.
See, I think I couldn't agree more, and I think that's very interesting coming back to Uranus, Gemini, and the United States, because a couple of those moments were decentral in a good way. Like if you actually think of what the Declaration of Independence is, that's a decentralization process. And the final Saturn quarter, aligning it to Armstrong's model, that's the, and it might be like, again, no one would have predicted. It sounds crazy to say, even at the beginning of the year, and there are a few members who didn't think it was going to happen when we're sort of looking at the end of the quarter or at the end of the decade, being when, if it's not a US civil war, it's at least a divorce, because it shows up the same. It shows up as a decentralization and either a complete change or removal of federal governance. And that's a good example of how power can decentralize in air, and also something to, like, dare I say, look forward to from an anarchist perspective, that there's more opportunity to do one's own thing as power decentralizes, good or bad. But that's the kind of, it shows up on the Civil War cycle, but again, kind of like not predicting World War, it doesn't mean civil war. It means divorce.
if we sub like division within a given polity or nation state for civil war, right? Yes. And civil war is certainly division, right? There's certainly obviously deep divisions to get to a civil war, but you can have that same underlying dynamic or impetus that isn't necessarily fought with grape shot cannons and bayonets.
Absolutely. And so that's, I think about that, and I wasn't sure where it was going to go. What we're talking about, because the changes are so dramatic that, yes, the new triplicity, we haven't even put our bags in the overhead compartment, let alone on the rest of that journey.
Yeah. And yeah. Okay. I kind of want to get back to, let me know when you're ready to head back to 2021.
I'm pretty
now
sure
that we've given like abundant context.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we're there now. Yes.
Okay.
So let's go in.
Okay. So again, the one thing to remember in terms of the collective astrology for 2021 and 2022, really the first quarter of the game is the Saturn square Uranus, right? Saturn controls security, organization, order, in conflict with Uranus, which is let's try something totally new, and also like let's throw chaos bombs. Sometimes Uranus is, how should we say, idealistic and revolutionary, but you also get this sort of Loki version of Uranus where it's just like, what if none of this turned out as expected? What if we just like sprinkle chaos on this, right? Sprinkle chaos on grain prices this quarter, or whatever it is. And so these two planets in their intrinsic natures are anything but allied. And so when they do come into conflict by angle in the sky, it's always really obvious. The last time we had them at a hard angle, like a 180 or a 90, was 2008 to 2010, right? And so there's this, that was their opposition. And so Saturn Uranus periods, You have Saturn sort of angry and saying like, please, why don't you play by the rules as they're written in the Monopoly game? And then Uranus, instead of just cheating, wants to like flip the entire board. And so it's a hard to navigate conflict, right? Like you can have contestation between different planetary powers, but compromise, they can agree on things. Saturnians have a very difficult time compromising. And in this case, with the signs they're in, it's Uranus and Taurus, and so the chaos and the board flipping is all very solid. It's all like things that you kind of take for granted, right? It's things that are supposed to be stable, just as Taurus is the fixed Earth sign, right? And so it's where the stable things go, right? So stores of value, money is supposed to be worth what it's worth. You're supposed to be able to, put it in a shoebox or a bank and it's fine, right? Food, there's supposed to just be food, right? We like it when food supply is stable, right? Food supply is something which benefits from stability. And then also labor, like, oh, people need jobs. People have this relationship to work. And so, I've been following, and I think it's very interesting how the events of 2020 have, and I don't know how this is playing out outside the US, but in the United States, a lot of people, didn't go to work or, for a while, or they work from home, like, they had a disruption in their labor, which again, usually you're like, well, I work on Monday through Friday, and then on the weekends I'm off, or I'm night shift. But like, it's another thing that benefits from stability, so you know what's going to happen. But a lot of people had that disrupted. And as things have opened back up, there are, tons of employers complaining that nobody wants to work for them, right? And that they have labor shortages. You also have, the stirrings of labor organization in newer industries and in old ones. There was actually a pretty dramatic coal miners strike, I believe, in Alabama over the last month. But this is another part of like the normally taken for granted, like, work sucks, but you got to go, right? Like that sort of standard attitude. Like getting, that board getting flipped, or at least, Loki's tapping the bottom, the corner of the Monopoly board that's hanging off the edge.
The labor thing's very interesting. So I'm up in Queensland, and we were just in the far north in the Daintree and the rainforest and off on the Great Barrier Reef. And because, well, it's interesting, it's open, but capacity restrictions, again, what they're for, make it more difficult for small businesses to survive, because a restaurant can't survive on 25% occupancy, right? But the other thing that happens is because no one can get in or out of this prison colony, the global tourism industry employs, it's like 100 million, 150 million people. That was obviously completely decimated last year, but it's a dynamic workforce that moves. So like a third of the people who are employed in tourism somewhere like the Great Barrier Reef are from Brazil and Scotland and wherever, and work in tourism on a global basis, so that they're trying to open to support this immense domestic demand, which hasn't been there before, because typically Australian holidays are too expensive for Australians, and we go to Bali or somewhere instead. So I was actually thinking about the Uranus and Taurus, like labor is just supposed to be there. Like if you have a job opening, someone's supposed to take the job, right? So they have these boats that are going out, or restaurants that have like 100 tables and 2 or 3 waitresses, because they can't hire anyone.
Anecdote to that point, we were driving around town the other day, and I think Taco Bell was hiring for $15 an hour, which is wild. I worked in fast food when I was 16, and I think I made 5 even. And like, yes, there's been inflation since then, but I'm not that old. It just shows how much people don't want to do those jobs, and it shows like the in the response of employers. And I know that it's not only Taco Bell, but that was the like striking example, because they had a big sign up front. McDonald's was still offering less, because of course they were.
Yeah. That's another, like I look at that from the counter economics perspective and go, well, yeah, Taco Bell, because it has very low cost of capital, can afford $15 minimum wage, and the independent taqueria around the corner can't, and so it'll go out of business. Crazy times. What I would say, because these aren't, and Antonia's just mentioned in the chat, it's not like these are great jobs, but what if we have just laid out, there's going to be some shit things that happen over the next decade. And what I hear a lot, particularly amongst members who are like, oh, I've got elderly parents, I can't move yet or whatever. One, live your own lives and adjust your own risk and scenario plan accordingly. But there's real opportunity in the current labor shortage in places where mobility is possible, right? So yeah, the jobs are shit, but like you can use that with a little bit of magic. There are places you may have always wanted to live, smaller cities or whatever. There won't be a time like this to be confident that you'll be able to get something when you land, or even beforehand. And yeah, they're not great jobs.
I mean, this could definitely be turned to, it depends on what skills you have and what kind of work you like doing. But the desperation on part of employers could certainly be turned to one's advantage.
Yeah, absolutely, I would.
Is it? Yeah, again, it ain't just Taco Bell.
No, correct. And there are companies all over. I mean, most of the financial news I look at is the United States, and there are companies in those what are now premium cities, so the quote unquote second cities, that people I think offer a better opportunity to live more of one's personal dreams and satisfactions at the moment and are foreseeable and that used to be the big cities, right? So London and New York and LA and whatever. Paris used to be where you go for that. It's less of that, or it's more that you can afford, or you can map to more scenarios in smaller locations now. And I know that it's very difficult because I've done it and you've done it, extracting from those big cities. It takes time and it takes risk and it takes confidence, and there needs to be something on the other side of that jump. And there is at the moment for a lot of people. So if that was something that's kind of held you back, well, what do I do and so on, this is a really good time to, if that's part of your scenario planning or part of your what you want for the next 5 years, now is the time to take that seriously, I think.
Yeah, I think so too.
Nice one. All right, so talking specifically, going back to Sataqua, as I call her, and Uranus. Oh no, hang on. And the Mars activation of that particular party in H2, it's July and November?
Yep, it's July and November, right? And so if you just want to look at 2021 in retrospect, if you're from the future, like the three activations are January, July, and October. Or sorry, January, July, and November. And I think the one in November looks the most severe. I think that July will seem pretty crazy, and it might sound like a little bit of doom speaking to say, oh no, November is going to be worse. But I think it will.
Yeah, I think so too. And again, to kind of look at what sort of thing it could be, I mean, we just have, but this is like, it's January 6th-ish, right? So there's going to be...
Yeah, I mean, when the Saturn Uranus tensions get enacted, right, it's very much like those who are defending an existing structure, like an existing organizational structure, versus those who are super unhappy with it, right? It looks like, I was thinking about this the other day, it looks like protesters outside a building that has real symbolic value, right? Like, an official building, an institutional building, right? It's the institutions and their discontents, to butcher Freud.
Yeah. So I think that's good. It's this isn't an Armstrong thing. I just found out about this guy, Cliff High. I think he's been on Higher Side Chats, but he has July, his analytics. I don't know anything about it, so I'm not endorsing this in any way. But he looks at some sort of deep shadow or deep signal on on the web and uses that as his predictive thing. And he has like July as a really shocking revelations from a US governmental perspective. And a lot of that's in the air. Like we're at that point.
It's going to be, well, let me just say, just characterize the July activation versus the November activation. July activation is Mars and friends in Leo, right? Loud, bright, solar. The November activation is Mars and friends in Scorpio. Not as loud, but much more dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's an alarming disinfecting sunlight in the July one. So there's stuff coming like, you know, Fauci emails, all this other thing. It could be literally anything. And again, I was thinking about how we frame this kind of stuff beforehand. And one of the things we've been doing amongst the membership is kind of like working at the level of the field. And it's been this big sort of project for Q2.
Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah.
The level of the field?
So looking for the right kind of metaphor or framework for understanding how to respond to Bayo Akomolafe, what if the way we respond to the crisis is part of the crisis? And there are a lot of thinkers like Bayo Akomolafe and Charles Eisenstein and Lynn McTaggart and people who have kind of informed that idea and the framework of the idea of the living field, right? So to be in support of the living field or operating at the level of the field, which is remote viewing and you know, generalized field effects, which is kind of where science or frontier science has been the last couple of decades. And so it's a question about how we solve things like interventionism. So that's when interventionism is part of the problem. That's why Bayo Akomolafe has that question, right? Or that rhetorical or trigger question. And Charles describes it differently, but it's the same sort of idea, which is it's not what to do about it, it's where can you do something. And so there's this whole elegant opportunity to be in relation rather than conflict and to operate. So you can have opinions about what's going on, but I don't think you should operate from them. I think you should operate towards, like, this is operating at the level of a field, is to operate towards your dreams rather than from your opinions. It's unavoidable to have them, but to operate from opinions is part of that, like, polarizing energy of responding to the crisis in a way that makes the crisis worse.
Yeah, or lets the crisis colonize your, you know, many of your waking moments and hours.
Yes.
I was actually just sort of debugging my mind the other day, and I was like, God, I have so many opinions in my head. I listen to too many podcasts, and I was just like, ugh, like there are all these opinions and my objections to those opinions, and I think, you know, like, oh, I think that's a good take, I think that's a mellow take. I was like, why? Like maybe a quarter of this is relevant and useful. Yes. I was like, why have I made so much space for all of these opinions and then my opinions about those opinions? I was like, this is fine, but like this can grow in like a little garden patch of opinions in the side of the yard. Like this doesn't need to like overrun the entire property.
No, absolutely. And because that would be responding to the crisis in a way that makes it worse, because you've just toxified your field for no discernible reason. There are times when maybe you have to, but I agree, that's absolutely part of it. Or my social media diet, or getting the shamanic energy medicine certification. There's things that you can, like, that's a question of, when I look at where we are, I'm not going to solve a return to, well, not even a return. I am not going to bring coherence to worldwide health. I can contribute on a healing basis with sufficient training and certification, right? So it's a what and where. If one of the fields of, or theaters is a better word because I keep using field. If one of the theaters of engagement is health, then it's not what to do about it. It's like, where can you do something? Go on.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. And what the thought that triggered in me, talking about being in relation. I think a lot of people are finding themselves in relation to history for maybe the first time ever, yes, and really like watching the collective story and, you know, quite reasonably concerned. And I think, you know, especially over just like this last year and a half, it's been really difficult to be in relation to history without getting completely hypnotized and sucked into it. and like feeling every hopeful thing that happens like as if it were something that happened in just your individual life, and every bad thing as if it were like something that just happened to your mom. Because and I think, I don't know, maybe it's everybody to some degree. As part of my job or role is to be in relationship to time and history. I've had a hard time with that at times, because it's like, no, this is part of my job, is to like be in relationship to these times, and then just like getting sucked in. And then the opposite, which is the like, well, I'm just going to, pour concrete over my head. And ignore it. And that's, that's good sometimes, but like there's clearly there's clearly like a golden mean sort of way of not ignoring where you are and what's happening to people, but also just like not getting, I don't know if it's possessed by it or eaten by it or, whatever.
Well, all of that kind of perpetuating toxicity and malice and polarization and anger is the famous metaphor of drinking the poison and hoping the other person will die. It's just not a good, it's not a good tactic. And I think, because I've obviously spent a lot of time with it as well, it's the sort of fortune teller's task. I told the members this, but my thing is, I'll never lie, and I'm not a coward. So take what you want out, like you don't believe anything I say, but when I say it, I'm not lying. This is absolutely
right. Good faith, good faith arguments and statements only.
Correct. That's a good part of it, but also like the role of the fortune teller as opposed to a Cassandra, and this is where it's why we kind of had the field discussions, is and why we just spoke about the last decade, and the fact that a lot of this is not going to look, well, none of it is going to look like what any of us have lived through before, and a lot of it isn't great. And so it's like, well, then where can we do things? And what I'm doing on a one-on-one, speaking of the shamanic energy medicine, what I'm doing on a one-on-one basis with people is kind of separating out the difference between what is a goal and what is a dream, and operating toward the level of dreams. A goal is a pay rise, but a dream is something bigger, right? Because as we move, particularly over the next 18 months, goals get less predictable. Dreams remain the same, in the sense of when you work at the level of the dream or the field, that's how you kind of move through disruptive times, and you don't, it's no longer a sequence of goals in a predictive environment. So there's ways that the medicine of fortune telling, if you have the bravery to, and it's just scenario planning, but when you have the bravery to actually look at what's going on, is there. And I think that's that's why we would do stuff like this or have calls like this or whatever, is it's not necessarily Cassandra stuff. It's like, well, we have to, if you intend to still be on Earth in a decade's time, then we have to talk about how we move in the direction of our dreams through what's going to be some fucking some wild times, some wild and unprecedented times.
I mean, it's like we said at excuse me, at As Above in 2019, that like we're back in history now.
Yeah.
Right. The comfortable Westerners are back on the roller coaster of history. That's sort of like that dream of the 90s. They're like, well, Cold War's over. I guess, was it Francis Fukuyama who's like the end of history?
Exactly.
We figured it out, right? There are going to be a few bumps, but we got this. No more surprises. And even if you didn't believe that or read that or whatever at the time, that was part of the I would say the dreaming of the West for a decade or two. It was increasingly challenged, but that broke last year.
Yeah. Yeah. And what we spoke about, which I think, and you said it, and it's absolutely true. There are some days, talking about not drinking the poison, and I don't, but there are some days, and one of them was, this messed with me, right? So the Make-A-Wish Foundation now requires terminally ill children who want to get on a plane to have like the double injections, and everyone else who comes with them. And I can't, when a civilization does that, it needs to end. These dying kids, what are you expecting, regardless of what you think happens with these ejections? They don't get it, and they're dying. And I'm like, when a civilization does that, there are some days where I'm like, I'm actually really, no, I'm not really happy this is happening. It's been a disaster, but I will have these flashes of, all right, bring it down, bring the whole thing down. Because as you mentioned last year, there is a lot about, dare I say, I don't know, maybe not most, but there is a lot about the Western dreaming that is, shall we say, up for critique, and I won't miss.
Well, and I think a lot of people who don't agree about anything else would agree with that.
Yeah, exactly.
That said, so that reminded me of something that I've been thinking about for like trying to think this time, right? So part of it is, there are pieces, there are cyberpunk pieces that make a lot of sense. Like one of them, I was thinking of William Gibson. I was like, this isn't this isn't Neuromancer. This is the Bridge trilogy, which occurs before that, right? Where you literally have the main character who looks through internet patterns as a type of divination, which is what you said. Somebody who was looking at July like saw it in a way that reminded me exactly of that character.
Yeah.
The bridge makes a lot of sense also as a metaphor. Like we're on our way to somewhere. But another piece of it from the past, right, that I think whatever visions of the future kind of need to be mated with knowledge of the past to get something semi-coherent. The triplicity cycle that rhymes with this one is the transformation of the sort of standard Roman Empire into the West. It's called the fall of the Roman Empire, but you've got the whole Eastern Roman Empire, which then historians later dubbed the Byzantine Empire. The people who were living in it didn't call themselves Byzantines. They were like, no, we're Romans, right? This has been Rome for 700 years or 500 years. And part of the Byzantine story is that it's kind of super corrupt, and there's a lot of leader changeover, and it doesn't seem great. I was really reminded of the sort of like half competent institutions which my nation sports right now. And I was thinking about it from that Byzantine perspective. I was like, it's a like half functional former empire can actually endure in a way at a level of incompetence that no one would dream that it could keep going at for a long time. Right. It took, it took Rome another 800 years to actually fall.
Yeah. So I don't know if you've read Through the Eye of a Needle, which is about the rise of Christianity and sort of how it gained traction with the Roman elite. And what you just said there reminded me of it, because after the move of the political power to the east, so that like the fall, as you say, it didn't actually fall. What happened was in Constantinople, they just sort of ignored the elite families in Rome, who were still like, well, I'm descended from this god, and they're living on the right hill, and they're issuing these things in the Senate and whatever, and it didn't matter. They just kind of got ignored. So they got to carry on thinking that they were these powerful bloodline families, and the business of living.
And I think that's really powerful and relevant. If we take it out of the context of like a formal religion, we talk about sort of what values are sacred in a given country or culture for a period of time. And, when we're looking at things on a historical level, hundreds and hundreds of years, sometimes there's a very powerful shift in those values. And, metaphorically or literally, the people begin to worship different gods.
Yeah.
I feel like we're as an American, I feel like we're absolutely at that point right now. Like literally the old statues, the old saints are being thrown down, right? And some real fucking assholes, but you know what I mean? But like they're like literally like it's the smashing of the old idols. And it's not really clear what the new, underlying sort of, what is held holy in that underlying dreaming. Like that's not clear and hasn't necessarily taken a discernible shape, or just how should we say a solid shape yet. No. But I think that we're at a point very similar or very parallel to that switch from Rome, which also happens during the big territory political shift from the standard Rome to the Byzantine.
Yeah. and there's more smashing to go. So like we sort of mentioned at the beginning, broadly speaking, from an Armstrong perspective and an Astro one, and we'll get back to November because this is germane to what I'm about to say. Next year is worse, and worse from this is Armstrong stuff, a civil unrest perspective and a plague perspective. So whatever happens, like the peak of the plague cycle is actually next year. So rather than, whatever it is, the Delta variant, which has a now 99.9% recovery rate according to UK numbers. Something happens next year where that is not the case. But it's when
there are a lot of human petri dishes out there.
Yeah. And when we talk about civil unrest being worse, what a lot of people don't realize is 49%. So basically half the countries of the world experienced civil unrest last year. So it's not just, it wasn't just the summer in the United States. Half the countries in the world experienced it, and that trend peaks next year. Most of the data I have is that it's in the US, and there's the possibility of suspended elections and other stuff like that, because there's panic cycles. The way Armstrong's model works is you kind of look at where the panic cycles line up in different, almost like planets, like what's civil unrest doing, what's elections doing, what's this, and you kind of go, well, that's interesting. There's a panic in these ones here, which suggests to me it could be something around that. But it's, again, when we look at the interplay that we've just been talking about, the sort of Saturn, Uranus, Mars dance.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And just from a like looking around perspective, pretty much nothing that people were pissed off about last year got fixed or is any better.
No.
Right? Like jobs, justice, and money. Like none of there's none of that's really certainly not better, maybe worse. Here's the astrology part that certainly looks like it coincides with that. That actually it starts at the end of 2021, but it completely encompasses 2022, right? And that is our friendly pairing, the Saturn Uranus square. Again, like when this gets activated, you get this stuff. The excuse me, the eclipse cycle moves to coincide with that. At the beginning, the very first instance of that is at the end of 2021 in November, but then that's all of the eclipses, excuse me, in 2022 activate the Saturn Uranus square. Excuse me. And so in particular, the eclipse has two sides, right? We have the dragon, and the dragon has a tail and the dragon has a head. And the head tends to bring the most energy. It brings like an often overwhelming, crazy amount of energy to something. The tail will tend to wipe away things, and with as much grace and gentleness as a dragon's tail would wipe, but there tends to be more of a removal. Whereas the dragon's head, that's the part that bites. That's the part that breathes energy, fire. It amplifies things. And so the eclipses on the dragon's head will be activating Uranus and feeding Uranus. And Uranus is our volatility buddy, right? So, so we get the first one of those in November, but then we get 4 in 2022, right? So, and then Mars keeps existing. Right. And so Mars will activate, this again in 2022. And so it's just bringing another, it's another activating factor that's really situated pretty clearly in 2022. There's a little bit of that, like I think that might bleed over into 2023, just as it starts a little early in 2021. But that eclipse team up with Uranus is basically a 2022 story, with like a sizzle reel in November.
A sizzle reel in November. Anything else about that sizzle reel, you think? Like if we go back to 2021, because that's the end of the year isn't great.
No, it's not great. So, sometimes you'll have like a brutal month, and then those skies clear up, and then things look really good after that. things don't, as we say, good and evil events don't all take exactly the same amount of time and like gently rise and then peak and fall, right? Sometimes there's a quick switch between one and the other. Sometimes things are favorable for a long period of time, unfavorable for a long period of time. And so with November, I mean, November is the sharpest part. But then that November comes into a December where we get ready to and start doing a Venus retrograde. And this Venus retrograde is at the end of Capricorn. And so it starts conjoined Pluto. And so because you may remember Pluto and Capricorn from 2020. And excuse me. And so because Venus is so slow leading up to the retrograde, we've really got like weeks of just Venus conjunct Pluto, which on a felt level, which Venus pushes and pulls and tugs and fires up and cools down the passions. That's a real bummer. It's big underworld feelings.
It is. There will be no Christmas for the children this year mood.
Yeah.
Or Christmas in the orphanage. Like it's quite. There's not enough ghosts for it to be Dickensian. We did that already, but it's more like a yeah.
But
anyway, gross.
And let me just say, the Q1 of 2022 actually has some fun stuff, right? But it's really like that kind of November into January is like it's a bummer of an arc. It's not all going to be excuse me, it's not all going to be fireworks. I think November in the months I'm not excited about, like sweepstakes, November absolutely beats December hands down, right? It's not just the same thing for months. But December doesn't like pull things up as much as I would like. I'd like to see a little wind beneath the wings.
And we spoke about this at the beginning of the year, but the November weather hits the EU's chart worse, and that's another upswing alignment, right? There's supposed to be German elections. The scuttlebutt is that maybe there won't be, and a similar thing will happen in France because they're already further ahead than anywhere else, the EU, in terms of getting the vaccine passports and whatever. The backstory to that is that the Eurozone is fucked. And it was fucked in 2019 from the perspective of how it funds itself, which means this was something that there was an opportunity at the end of 2019. We could have had another 2008, like another Lehman incident, which would have brought Europe and the euro down. And instead we had going direct and effectively the urgent replacement of bond sales as a method of funding government with this sort of app and currency replacement that's happening. And Europe is more urgently interested in that. So I don't think they're going to let anything stop as much as possible the rollout, which will include things like suspending elections and so on, is the scuttlebutt. But one way or the other, they've already had it worse this year, and they get November in the neck.
Yeah, on a very simple level, if anyone just Googles EU chart, you'll see that it's all fixed stuff. And that's where the stuff, planets in fixed signs. And that's where all the trouble in November is. And that's where the 2022 trouble is as well.
Yeah. And again, I can't see, and you wouldn't need an AI to do that. From a currency perspective, I know Americans think their dollar is going to collapse any second now. It won't. It does eventually, but not till like the very end of the Saturn decade we're talking about. It's the worst house on the street from a currency perspective is the
euro. Right. It's a relational game.
Yes,
it's not an absolute game.
Yeah. And so again, that's one of the things. If you are, we do this from a scenario plan perspective, because if you're listening to this from within the EU, it's better that you know it. It's better that you can do things. And there are other things. I mentioned this last year, and I got my sister to do it, and so on. You don't know how they're going to roll something like that out. And when they do, when people try to do when governments try to do big, crazy currency shifts, what happens is you end up with, and it'll be the US dollar as a pseudo currency at the same time. So if you ban physical euros, what happens then is that people start using US dollars. And it's one of the reasons, one of the things that actually strengthens the dollar in the short term is that everyone else is going to go fucking with their currencies first. And the things people do when that happens, when a country collapses, is they use the reserve currency, which is currently the US dollar. It's been other things before. And so there are things you can do, and even just to kind of get your head around the idea that it's, as far as I can tell, and maybe Austin, is going to hit the EU worst, the kind of second half of this game. So to the end of 2022, hits the EU at least first, if not worst. Worse is a different question. And if you know that, like even just knowing it is its own kind of medicine. So when it happens, you're not like, anything else? Yes, no?
I don't think so. I mean, not about, just one thing, because I've been focused on articulating the trouble spots, which, are also easier to see. I really like a lot of September. September's like end of August, like first couple weeks of September, there's some just really pleasant stuff. If you want to like do something fun or social or whatever, there's some pretty friendly skies, like end of August, maybe first half, 3 weeks of September.
Good. I will, we'll do something for James's birthday. That will be something to look forward to, given that I had to abandon mine today with border closures and the rest of it up here. More of that. So anything else we want to say about H2 before we hit the questions?
I don't think so. Well, so one thing that's just, if you're looking at kind of what the planets are doing, I've been trying to pick out the very favorable and unfavorable spikes, because those are the most impactful things. But there's whatever fires July sets, and I hope they're not near my house or anybody else's house, knock wood. They don't go out, or there's this very real, as I was looking over the months, there's this very real like smolder that happens. The sun and Mars start moving together, and they move together for months at a time. And so and what's interesting about when a planet's with the sun is that you can't see it with the naked eye, right? It is incapable of arising with its own light. And so, but it's Mars and the sun both being very hot, very like, it's literally kind of a stewing. And so I think that's sort of showing us some of the coals of discontent that how should we say, endure for the journey between July and November.
Interesting. That the explosion and smoldering is, if it is revelatory, and that would track. And one of the things that got people to do, members last year, is to allow this moment to transform you, right? Because if you don't, it will destroy you. This is serious now, and a big part of that is, and I've spoken about it before, is losing two worlds. And it comes back to what you were saying about, why am I carrying all these takes in my head? And you just need to be open to, let me put it this way, if you're still 2 weeks to flatten the curve, you need to let go of the idea that you know how reality works. It doesn't mean someone else next to you is right, but it means you are wrong.
That's really interesting. That's almost exactly that resonates almost perfectly with what I was thinking, which is that embracing uncertainty and ambivalence about the big things that you don't really have to know. How that, you don't need to know the fate of the United States in 10 years or how it's going to be to live in Tennessee in 2032, right? If you live in, I don't know, Louisiana or fucking Wisconsin or whatever, like there are these, and this is the takes, right? Which takes are actually useful to think about because they're relevant to my life. and our need for certainty is much greater there. But I feel like there's been a strong tendency to replace certainty in a thing that obviously is not the case now with like an opposite certainty, rather than replacing it with a like, I don't know, we'll see. I've read this and I've read that, and this makes sense. This seems more plausible, but I can wait and see, because my action in the next 6 months does not depend on having this 100% pegged.
Yeah, I would say the other thing that alarms me more, because it's true, is what the people who won't allow this moment to transform themselves because their identity is wrapped up in particular, this sort of pseudo-virtuous identity of compliance. And this is the anarchist take, right? As that becomes, as that is shown to be not for your benefit, and it never is. Like, this is the anarchist take, right? That the predator class operates in class interest. To become sanctimonious and vicious and just turn into a bully, rather than allow it to transform you, only hurts you. Right. And so if you're still, that's the thing you have to release. You have to let go of that.
And I would say that's really interesting. I think that's the Saturn side of the Saturn Uranus thing. And the other side of it is being overly identified with being the virtuous rebel. Yeah. Right. Like, I'm always like, there's so much virtue invested in the idea of the rebel, especially in the West, where so many of the countries had successful revolutions in the last couple of 100 years. Right. There's a lot of virtue invested in both of those roles. And over identification with either of them is toxic.
Yes, absolutely. And so we all need to not be that, but we also need to not be around or allow, this is a different way of saying it, or allow the poisons that they insist on drinking just because they're drinking them to drink them ourselves, right?
Well, can we say this is the age of air? And so we don't even have to make the mistake of drinking them. Like, these are airborne poisons, right? Yeah. There's so much like mind poison just in the air. And it's, if you're anywhere near a computer, there are wonderful things on the computer and useful things on the computer, but it's also just like a boiling cauldron of, I don't know, of toxins of various flavors and levels of toxicity. If anything, it's like we need to become more like conscious. How should we say, a conscious dialogue or relationship to poison. Poisoners I don't know what you would call them, but people who dealt with poisons in the past would often microdose poisons so that if they ever gave themselves a macrodose by accident, they would be less susceptible to it, which is like, and you can do that with a lot of snake venom as well. But it's like, there's no like living in a world that's not full of mind poison right now. And so like, again, like this kind of loops back to what we were talking about earlier with the like how to be in relation without getting sucked in. Absolutely. Or letting something possess you.
Absolutely. And we did that by focusing on points of consent or agreement. So we focused on win-win rather than win-lose. And the win-lose stuff is, you can use it as a hobby, again, as long as you can microdose the poison.
It's a sport.
Yeah. And this is how, I navigate family. Most of the family has enough areas of win-win. There's, a few that don't, and there aren't as many areas of win-win. But especially if July happens the way this Cliff High guy says or whatever, because it's only been 30% or 40% of the Fauci emails that have been FOIA'd out. It might not be that. But like if your identity is caught up in compliance with official reality, this is the sort of burning fire and smoldering, it might be challenging for you. And so you have the opportunity to drop any pretense that you know how reality works, because you don't. And that will be very healing. And that will allow you, because we're the pivot point in this story where we've been patently lied to about a bunch of stuff. And it doesn't mean that the people who point that out are correct, as we've just said. It's more you're only getting in your own way if you refuse, if you're not allowing this moment to transform you, right? Because what I've had spirits tell me this, the only thing powerful, and I mentioned this to Nick, the only thing powerful enough to destroy Western frameworks are Western frameworks themselves. So at the beginning of May, when we started doing our own member responsive stuff, I'm like, well, the media is going to destroy itself by doing this. Politics has already destroyed itself by doing what it's done. Medical authority, same thing, where like the pillars that keep the West up are destroying themselves because they're the only things that are strong enough to do it. And if your identity is bound up in that stuff being correct, you will be destroyed. And you don't need to be. We will all be transformed. Some of us will be destroyed. Like it's big stuff we're living through. And the best thing you can do is some kind of releasing. And we did this as group members, and we did fire ceremonies so that if you release everything you know about how you think reality works, you run lighter, you're shallower on the draft. And that is very useful for the next 18 months.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would also add, there's kind of the point that you ended on there is ironically, that was Descartes' project, was to start over again from first principles.
Yeah, love it. Love it.
I don't necessarily agree with what he built out from there, but like it is funny that that's like, you know, a rational saint of the modern West, and yet absolutely. Like that's the project. I think you know, we maybe the West needs to remember how to do that.
I think so. All right, let's do some questions. Very good. We could say a record-breaking 113-degree heat dome this weekend in Portland has been clear. Mars and Leo joining the Saturn-Uranus tangle, right?
Yeah, absolutely. 113 here too.
There you go.
New June record, but not all-time record. Veronica has got a half question. Will this have the same effect on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency? That is, if you're talking about Uranus and Taurus, yes, and yes. I mean, you only get things like that because of Uranus and Taurus. Yeah, I mean the whole bundle of digital currency blockchain experiments, that is a Uranus and Taurus story.
Absolutely.
And so both the successes and failures and the rises and falls, like that it's and so when we look at the nodal or eclipse activation of Uranus and Taurus next year, that tells us even bigger things happen in that story next year, maybe starting at the end of this year. But it doesn't necessarily tell us whether it's, you know, good, bad, or other. It just tells us like, oh, there's, you know, this is where the energy and the action and the drama is.
And going back to the triplicity change that we're at the first second of, inarguably, the currency by the end of the triplicity, like we call it crypto, you can call it whatever you want. Money will be something like crypto. It has to be. This is the thing I learned from Catherine Fitz, right? You can't run a multi-planetary civilization on like little paper squares because someone has to fly out to Mars to refill the ATMs, right? So even though what they're building at the moment, I am profoundly and ideologically against from an anarchist perspective, because they're replacing currency with like a gamified free-range prison. It fails, but that's the plan, guys. I'm bullish on Bitcoin in particular. So, you know, chaos magic and a chaos magic. Yes, we are in the beginning of a process of changing on a long-term basis how, like, that's the triplicity thing. We're going to have a digital currency one way or the other. There's no for it to be a free-range prison that will switch off if you're too fat and you haven't walked 45 minutes that day, or you watch the wrong thing on the internet so now your children don't eat, which is actually what they're building. No need for it to be that. But yes, crypto is, and it's also part of the inflationary trend, especially Bitcoin, because people don't realize how few of them there actually are, and more people want them. That's literally scarcity-based inflation.
Well, and there's a little piece of age of air stuff, and this is not the century has become unfavorable for overly ambitious projects of centralization. You know, the thing with money is, like, you know, let's say I try to get everybody to use my money. If my money sucks, there's plenty of other monies to use, right? There's an inherent like competition built into currencies and money, and that's only growing by the day.
Yes.
Right. There aren't less monies every day. There are more monies every day.
I like that. And more like means and methods of exchange, right? Because the other thing that's happening is not necessarily, well, barter, it's kind of fake. Barter doesn't really exist. This is like, again, an anarchist take. But if you look at the app-based efficiency that has, and there's ways of critiquing it positively and negatively, but people are finding ways of sharing and exchanging resources and value with neighbors that are non-monetary. So as you say, like if you're, and one of the things that I think we can do, and I'm certainly doing, but I know we discuss as members and people are looking for it, is again, I think we all have to be anarchists in the sense that we need an understanding of counter economics in this moment. There are things, counter economics can be described as operating at the level of the field if you're doing that right, which is we have to be the thing that comes next, and that is non-monetary forms of exchange and stores of value, and kind of realizing, well, what does a good life look like? This is coming back to the dreams. What do I actually want? Because the things that I had previously assumed would be there to get me to what I want, stable jobs and money and so on, going away. But I still want things. Remember, we all have to, looking at how dark things are getting, remember that we came here for this. We chose this time. Sometimes I wonder, but we chose this time. We did to go through this, right? And I'm pretty sure I didn't come here for it to all be shit. So there's a wider or more animist way of saying counter economics, which is kind of supporting what you did there, which is expanding it out past money. And that's what's going to happen when they roll out these control-based currency replacements, is if you have a language of value exchange that operates outside of it, you're going to be much better positioned to respond to however things are going at that point in time, knowing your neighbors, mowing their lawn, doing whatever kind of exchanges of value, mowing their lawn for babysitting, whatever it happens to be. Yeah. All these things you can do now, and we should do now, right? That's part of the transformation. Be the Uranus in your own Taurus. All right.
Rather than the reverse.
Yes, exactly. Ooh, yeah. well done.
You mess with the bull.
I'll do the butt jokes around here. Thank you very much. What would Austin say the astrology says about human splicing with animal research?
So I wouldn't say I've thought about that a lot. If I'm just off the cuff, I'm going to put that in Saturn and Neptune and Pisces, because that is such a surreal signature. Yeah. That because that's literally just a vision from either dream or nightmare or myth or Island of Dr. Moreau. Yeah, like exactly that kind of thing belongs in Saturn and Neptune and Pisces. Doesn't mean nobody will do anything mess with that, but like that'll show up, I think. Then that would be my guess, because that's where the obvious. Not so we're this is like disruption time, right? Like Saturn Pluto last year was just like doom time, where I believe, as you dubbed it in like 2017, Gordon, like the goat god of death, right? Which is like, we were all in that Rider-Waite devil card, and we were tied to the stone, right? Yeah. Whereas now this year and next year, this is like shit's crazy and keeps being crazy, and I don't know what to do about it. Right, because that same Saturn-Uranus struggle is real on a microcosmic level as well. Right, it's like I'm trying to keep it under control, Saturn, but all this shit keeps happening, and I kind of want to change everything. But it's that's that. But then we go into like whatever deep, weird, heavy dreaming that Saturn and Neptune and Pisces is. Yeah. That's good. So fish monsters in the second Saturn quarter. Yeah. Well, I would say maybe I was thinking about deep sea earlier today, like the wondrous and monstrous creatures of like the aphotic zone where light no longer reaches,
Yeah.
where you get forms and colors that are, very dreamlike, right? They're more beautiful than normal things and than land things, and they're also more monstrous.
Cool. All right. Ren has the god archetype of Neptune / Poseidon doesn't feel like a good match for
No,
the
it's not.
planet.
It's terrible.
Yeah, there you go. Is there a better archetype to match planet Neptune for prayers and other magic work? Good question.
So I've said Dionysus before. Dionysus is okay. I think you could literally go Morpheus. Like you can literally
Yes.
go
Yeah,
like, Morpheus with your retinue of Onoroi, like dream deities. In a piece I wrote, God, like in 2011, I think I matched it with the goddess Maya, right? Who is the goddess of the illusion of the real, which is the real. So, if we're comparing, that's a tricky term, right? Might be like, oh yeah, that's fake. It's like, well, no, but like you're using what you think is real as a yardstick to measure something fake. But what that idea, especially in Buddhism, means is that your yardstick is less real than other things, right? Which, when you get really complicated like this, and start circling back and needing to constantly modify one statement with the other, that's a good sign that you're in the Neptune zone. But yeah, it's the dreaming, it's the big, it's the last real planet that encircles all the others. Just as you were talking about, the dream contains, like if you have a dream, then it contains and to a certain degree organizes all of the pieces to make it so, right? The martial action, the mercurial cleverness, all of that. And so like big dreaming types of deities, and definitely try to find that in a tradition you work in or that you're familiar with and have good contact with. Don't feel the need to like shoehorn in like the Greek Morpheus. That was just the first thing that came to mind.
It's a good one though, Morpheus. Yeah,
it's not bad.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna think about that. Like there's a couple of them that are
there's also in more Vedic stories, you have like an underworld kind of demonic, kind of not architect named Maya, who is a master of actually creating things, but is also considered kind of shady, at least in those stories, who's the like kind of the underworldy or Azura counterpart to Vishvakarma, who's like the celestial builder and architect and designer, sort of like you'd say the shadow of the architect is literally named Maya. And there's that, like, if you look into that mythology, maybe start with Vishvakarma, because you can then find Maya in his story. That might be a place to look to if you Vedic sphere stuff speaks to you.
Very cool. What do you think of the November 8, 2022 eclipse? He said, Noah's got, that seems like the collapse of Europe. I'll jump in there first, because whenever we talk about that, Europe's seen some stuff. It won't collapse. The EU certainly ends, but Europe's a different being. Like we're talking about the EU chart. We're not talking about Europe. Yeah.
And the EU chart it's not, how should we say, the fate of every nation. That is that agreement, that binding, that contract, as its own entity that has its own life cycle.
Absolutely. But in answer to your question, from an Armstrong perspective, the panic cycles are why it looks like there might not even be midterms in the US. You might swap out your president. Realistically, the one you've got now might die. I mean, that seems more likely, but the politics in Europe and the US in particular next year is a mess. From an Armstrong perspective, like I said, you haven't seen anything like it, the chaos that's coming. And it's not surprising then that we have civil unrest, because you don't even need to know. This is interesting, isn't it? Like, and this is what I mean about have opinions, but don't operate from them. You don't even need a take on what you think that's going to be, just to know to almost stay away from it, right? Stay away from getting emotionally involved in a thing that's going to happen one way or the other, and move toward, not from opinions, but toward dreams. And that's all I can, when I say all I can think of, that's not a consolation. that is the teaching of this moment, right? I think it's one of the things we all came here to learn.
Yeah, it's like learning to, should we say, operate under history weather.
Yes.
Right. And some people, some of us have a particular role to play that, we could say our dharma, our calling, whatever it is, our best life, may very well intersect with the events at one period of history or another. But that's not all of us all of the time.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. These are good questions so far. Thanks, everyone, because these are challenging times, and we need those discussions, and we need to have them in this mature way. So well done, everyone, so far. Penny, can you go a little deeper with the future illness thing? What might that look like from a disease perspective? Well, see previous answer. So the peak of the plague cycle, because I mean diseases do go in cycles, but the peak of the plague cycle from an Armstrong perspective next year was in play long before we embarked on a maniacal effort to get every human being on the planet injected in something that hasn't left safety trials. Do I think that's it? Do I think it's the people who have it versus the people who don't, who are going to be more severely impacted by the peak of the plague cycle next year? I don't know. And again, it's one of those things that forecasting is good for, because the only thing I can tell you with complete certainty is that, and it's been true all the time, is that you are sovereign over your health. So whether you've taken the injections or not, I don't care. Live your lives. That's, absolutely, you're right. That's literally the anarchist position. I don't like the mandating of anything. Pick an injection, go for your life. But regardless of that, health sovereignty is yours, right? And so knowing that from a space weather perspective, next year looks like what we've been through, or what sort of, next year is a continuation of many aspects of the story we're halfway through, and the fact that the plague cycle peaks. Just knowing that should give you, we did this last year, remember we did Healthy Girl Summer, you can do it again. You will always be sovereign over your own health, and it's almost a negative impact on that health sovereignty to speculate, because you might fall down a YouTube, well, not anymore, nothing good is on YouTube, but you might fall down a BitChute rabbit hole and come to a very definite conclusion that it's going to be the people who took these two kinds of injections or the people who didn't. And if you set off with that as your certainty, you are not in as good a position to move through next year as the people who set off with health sovereignty. And that can include injections. I don't, like I said, literally don't care. You can make that decision for you. So it's one of the things that when you drop down to the level of detail, scenario planning, which is useful, becomes much less useful because you can spin off on a take or an opinion. And I wouldn't, right? And before
Well,
you go. Yeah.
I just want to interrupt for just a second. This circles back to the uncertainty bit or ambivalence, because again, it's so seductive to feel like a piece of what might be a dangerous variable.
Yeah.
But in fact, you're probably more safe, leaving and be like, I don't know, that could definitely happen, but so could this other thing, right? Like you can. It's the thing about the art of uncertainty or ambivalence is it's not just like, oh, I don't fucking know. You can say, I don't know, I've narrowed this down to a basket or like a bouquet of likely things. It's not every flower in the meadow, where it's like, all right, these particular four were particularly lovely and elegant, and I can't meaningfully discard them, right? And so I will carry this bouquet of possibilities with me, but not, pretend I'm on The Bachelor and have to pick one.
No, I think absolutely. And this is part of allowing that moment to transform you, because that's not, and I've certainly learned this from initially being really, really dismayed at how fucking dumb people are last year, and sort of sitting with transforming that into useful intelligence, was humans aren't good at scenario planning. They aren't good at operating at a multiple scenario risk-based perspective. They want, and by the way, Penny, I don't mean you in this. I'm going on a previous rant. You just asked a question, which was what we asked for. Humans just aren't good at this kind of stuff, which means until you're used to it, you have to do it consciously. You have to consciously look at, okay, I think what's happening from a health perspective is really alarming. And instead of taking the next step of going, do I think it's the people with injections or the people without that are going to be severely impacted? That's not it. You're going to be like, this is, there is a future health incident that's going to be worse than what we've been through. The right thing to do is improve my health. and that's not, you have to allow that to become familiar. It's just not something we're used to doing. It's funny, like it brings up a story which Alberto tells in shaman school about this poor farmer, parable really. One day the farmer's one horse flees and like out into the hills, and his neighbor says, it might be a Buddhist story, that's unlucky. And the farmer says, might be lucky, might be unlucky, who knows? And then the next day the horse comes back and it's leading a whole bunch of wild horses. And the neighbor says, that's lucky. And the farmer says, might be lucky, might be unlucky, who knows? And then the next day the farmer's son breaks his leg trying to break in one of the horses. And the neighbor says, that's unlucky. Farmer says the same thing. And then the next day the king declares war on a neighboring kingdom, and the farmer's son can't go because he has a broken leg. Might be lucky, might be unlucky. There's a way of being with the arrival of events that can promote coherence, and that's in that story.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. John has a question. I know that most of the astrological effects have had their discussion centered around North America, EU, and China, but do you have any, John bringing the Philippines specifics, have any pronouncements for Southeast Asia, especially the Philippines, as we are entering a highly contentious election year in 2022, assuming it happens? It's a political year from hell is the answer Armstrong gets, but as you know, because you remember as well, anytime I get stuff about other countries, and we got some New Zealand stuff last night, I will throw it in there. But you go, Austin. What have you got to add?
Oh, I don't think I can comment. I'm I don't know what charts are used for the Philippines. And I'm just not as familiar with the situation. I can't really meaningfully say how the astrology interacts with that. What I can say is that generally speaking, if we're in if like a big, important, complicated thing like an election is supposed to happen within a wedge of time that looks, gnarly, then that's probably not going to go. It's probably not going to be great. Right. Exactly. That we can just we can judge the wedge of time. And maybe one way to look at it on a very simple level is if you're like, if the thing happens in a gnarly wedge of time, then it will then you're looking more at how could this go wrong, or how could this play out in an ugly way. Whereas if it's an unusually nice wedge of time, especially if it's much nicer than what people have been going through, because we always like reset normal to whatever we're living through. And so when there are, terrible configurations and all that, we're like, oh, that's normal. And just a little ray of sunshine is like, oh, I never expected the sun to shine again, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. And so, you look at the thing, and then if the time period is nice, then it'll be a little smoother than maybe you were thinking. And if it's gnarly, look at the negative possibilities, how it goes sideways.
And the only thing just suddenly realizing I would add to that is that the Philippines has the same problem Australia does, which is it's in the process of, so our chief military ally is fighting with our biggest export market. And what both the Philippines and Australia would need to navigate that is a statesman. And neither of us have it. There are no statesmen. It's one of the kind of losing the mandate of heaven moments that we're in. You do not have, and neither do I, John, politicians who are up to the task of moving into China's century. And where it's more acute for the Philippines, of course, is that you are closer to the inevitable theaters of conflict that are going to happen, or may happen, or are more likely to happen in the middle of this decade, right? So that's
contested zones.
Yeah, exactly. But the challenge is there, and your politicians are as simply not up to it as ours.
Well, and that raises a really, I think, interesting question, Gordon, which is like, when do we get our like age of air leaders? Like the people who are like, okay, I see this, right? So we're not going to apply like a 1964 Cold War model to the present because we're just in a different era. You know, a lot has been, there's been a lot of, I don't know, I think deserved wailing and gnashing of teeth about how I don't want to say this in a shitty way, but how old a lot of the people in the highest positions of power in the United States are. And youth doesn't fix everything, but like, as far as, you know, orienting towards the times, it can be very helpful. And it'll be really interesting to see what, you know, the leaders, good, bad, and other, but like the age of air leaders, like what they look like as they arise as a crop.
That will be interesting, because there'll be, I'll have to think about that, because I feel like they're going to be at the top. There's going to be not much in the way of middle management, right? So there's going to be the top, and then there's going to be like a community-based relational stuff, and then there's going to be distant. I'm just thinking like from the 2030s, that's literally going to be the case, but yeah, that is a good one.
Well, I don't know. It makes me think of, again, like who are the good leaders, who's really effective during the age of air last time, right? And that was like the age of air last time began with the with the Mongol conquest, right? And it's like almost thinking of the cons, like who can lead a mobile horde, right? It's the age of air, right? Like who can lead a mobile nation, right? Like not who can defend a castle best. Who can defend a castle best was not the, was not the winning strategy. It might have been a useful skill at certain points, but it was like who could lead a mobile collective, a dynamic mobile collective. That seemed to be the style of leadership.
That brings up what we were talking about last week, just privately, which is when we're looking at the historic parallels. Who gets to be the barbarians and what do they look like? And we've sort of settled on people with like their own cryptocurrencies, or people with kind of like mastery over digital currency and other, because that's sort of like the horse, right? To be able to.
And it's worth noting that if we look at Alexander's conquest, a big part of his military superiority was his extremely innovative use of cavalry.
Yeah,
right? So it's the horse again.
Because what we're talking about, the sort of shift, whatever you want to call it, the Pachacudi, which I'll tell the members about, but it's basically allow this moment to transform you. No, I'll get to it in a minute, but what happens the last two times that Austin was mentioning, so Mongols and the quote unquote fall of Rome, as in the rise of Constantinople. The barbarians quite literally made out like bandits. So there are people, so there are ways of being with this moment that have opportunity and promise, right? And so that's why we were having the discussion. It's like, who are the barbarians this time around? And I mean that in a non-judgmental way, of course.
Yeah.
The Romans didn't. I mean, and when I say non-judgmental, with the sort of the dispassionate view of an historian, but who are the barbarians this time around?
Yeah, well, who are the people who lived in, how should we say, more mobile arrangements?
Absolutely. And that we don't have an answer to that, by the way. Like we just sort of said, well, it'll be something that doesn't exist yet in the crypto space, might be the replacement for the horse. But we leave that as a question for you, that at moments like this, there are barbarians, and I don't necessarily, it's not as glib as saying, be the barbarians, but think about being the barbarians. Rather than not. Awesome. Next one. For those of us in high fire danger areas, any space weather coming up in Q3 that might particularly favor mitigation? Mansion's got your back.
What was the question again?
Someone who also lives in the high fire danger, is there any kind of like space where there are any elections that might favor mitigation?
I would. I've had good success with petitioning Jupiter since it's been in Pisces to make it rain, and that's like that's the phrase, right? Because that works for fortune and it works literally. Had a couple really successful experiments over the last month and a half with that. It's Jupiter in a water sign. You got about 1 month of it left. Make it rain.
True. Well, actually, the next question is, what might we expect for Jupiter going retrograde back to Aquarius for a few months?
Well, so, excuse me. My voice is a little worn out. Well, so just travel back in time to the period from January up until May 15th. That's what Jupiter in Aquarius feels like. And then, then we had this little window of Jupiter in Pisces. On a technical level, moving back into Aquarius puts Jupiter in Saturn's sign while Saturn's there. So Jupiter, whatever hope, luck, divine power, wisdom, et cetera, that you're hoping to wield or petition or embody, that goes back under Saturn lock and key. It doesn't mean that it's impossible. It doesn't mean that Jupiter's not allowed to do anything. It's not house arrest, but Jupiter kind of has to get Saturn's permission. And Saturn's right there watching, right? And so a positive version of that is, instead of with like Jupiter and Pisces, like creating something new, like I want a new good in my life. It's instead using the Jupiterian drive towards improvement or betterment to make the structural reforms that your life is calling for, like the boring Saturnian structural reforms.
Interesting. I like it. Can either of you, this is interesting, can either of you, Austin, recommend a starting point for learning about heliacal rising stars and how to work with them magically?
You wouldn't necessarily work. I mean, you would approach them as you approach stars magically. If you know how to do that, you don't need a different ceremonial version of that. Heliacal rising is when a star or a planet has been obscured by the rays of the sun for a while, and then you get to first see it again, right? It's like back out, it's back into the world. It's back into the visible world, which is important if you were a, luminous being like a star. And so, a lot of cultures are like, hey, you're back, right? And so that's, I would I would probably build it around, hey, you're back, and then everything else.
Hey, you're back. Yeah, that's cool. Paul's got one I'm a bit confused by, but I'll have a go first. I remember about this time last year, we had some not so successful stimming predictions. Want to give it a go again. Any freebies in the astro weather? Well, first of all government
were the predictions stimmy?
Stimulus, I think US stimulus.
But okay.
All government money comes with a sock to the jaw, as Catherine Fitz says. So don't call it freebies. We are replacing currency with a free-range digital totalitarian grid. So and other than that, because there's another question from Michelle about how does the buying up of real estate by groups like BlackRock fit into this? I see free money everywhere, Paul. I just think it's in the wrong hands. So the billionaire spree of last year continues, right? But yeah, give it a go again, and it is what it is. The next step will be payments based on injection compliance, which will be managed by an app. You might get some random checks in between now and then, but that's where that all goes, and that trajectory is still in play. What do you reckon, Austin? Free money in the horizon?
I don't know. I don't think so for America. I mean, there's been a lot of difficulty just getting like an infrastructure package done, which I understand, which is, it will stimulate certain sectors and, be useful for certain people, but that certainly doesn't look like, if that's really difficult, the idea of more checks going out seems pretty unlikely.
No, and there's a $40 billion for more IRS inquisitors in it too, which are obviously going to come for the small and medium-term businesses. So the reset continues.
I'm getting and so that's a good scenario planning health, right? Like have your ducks in a row if you have a small and medium business.
Yeah, do, because they're coming for it. There's the best goal. So if you look at what, and this is like a Schwab thing, but we're sort of halfway through his 3 R's towards the reset. And so we're at particularly the US, is at the reopening, and the final R is the reorganization. So it's actually, what world do we want to live in now? Which is why, this is what I mean, we're at the midpoint of this narrative, and they will have to do some things to tip everyone into the compliance app to get the money into it. And I think that's why you're not going to get more checks, because I think it's going to be that. And I think it's going to be the removal of sort of moratoria on evictions and all that kind of stuff, because it needs to get shit for people to clamor for the app. But there's free money everywhere if you are, as Nichelle mentions, BlackRock or Blackstone, or any of them that are now the 2 largest landlords in the United States. And that's towards the you will own nothing and be happy world, right? Because they need to move out of bonds, because the bond market is going away because we're replacing currency. And if they move into this, if they move into middle-class housing, when you get access to, this is the plan, when you get access to housing based on your compliance, you'll own nothing and be happy, based on your compliance to the app. The housing you will have access to will be owned by these companies, and it will be the state that pays those companies. So it's you're moving to a different asset class, whereas, and it's good for them because bonds yielded like 1% the last few years, if you could get a good one, and you'll be getting 11% from these new assets. But that means they will be unaffordable for people. You will own nothing and be happy. This is the plan. I don't think it works, but I don't think enough people know that this is the plan. So the kind of up and the down of it's going to suck. And I think that's sort of evident in the weather. But that's two. I wanted to answer those two together, Paul, because there's stimulus everywhere, like there has never been before, as this kind of Uranus and Taurus reorganization of value happens around us. We need to be the barbarians. Cool, answer live or done. Oh, I think I missed that. Done. No, good. Lucky last. What shall I do? What should we do? That one seems too detailed. No, you can ask that as a Q&A thing, but it's in the space weather, and it doesn't, the up and the down of it. Like, he wants to know why the techno crazy won't work. It fails because it is fundamentally a tyrannical system, and once people work that out, and you can notice that in the pH. I expect, and I don't know how, but I expect that is a big part of the civil unrest that happens around the world. Well, is happening around the world, but will continue to happen. So I don't know. I don't have a take on it. I'm just scenario planning the up and the down of the hijack. But Jay's question, in terms of opportunity to change, can you speak a bit more about those Pluto-Venus conjunctions and the space weather around those, thinking more on a personal, interpersonal level, but anything pertinent?
Yeah, so Venus-Pluto conjunctions in the sky. So Venus is the primary, like, relational planet. And generally, like, positive relations, but, you know, feeling positively about people, we form relationships, and then very intense and personal negative experiences, you know, inevitably, well, I don't know if inevitably ensue, but you know, you can't have your heart broken without having had intimacy, right? So it's that whole sphere. It always has to begin with a good, right, to even get that close. And so when you have what Pluto brings to that, and I like to think of Pluto in terms of an underworld gate. You know, it's useful to think of the planets as actors and figures, and to a certain degree that's useful for Pluto, but Pluto really is like the gate between the inner solar system and the planetary world, and, you know, the Kuiper belt and everything else out there, you know, in the darkness of space. And so, you know, thinking of Pluto as a gate to the underworld that opens, and then things can come up from that, like things that were long hidden. And then sometimes you go down into that and do a sort of catabasis of the heart. And that's particularly resonant with Venus stationing retrograde on Pluto, because the sort of go-to most useful mythic model for Venus retrograde is Inanna's descent into the underworld, which is very much a relational journey. Like she finds out her sister's husband is dead, right? Like it's very relational. And anyway, and that also tracks with what you see during a Venus retrograde, which is Venus is visible in the west and gets dimmer and dimmer, and you see less and less of Venus, then disappears, and then several weeks later appears again in the east, doing the how should we say, the death travel of going down in the east and then coming up, or excuse me, going down in the west where the sun sets every day, and then arising again with light after a period of absence in the east, as the sun does every day. And so, there may be some death rebirth stuff in relationship land, or part of when you bring underworld motifs to relationship land, it's like, finding out secrets, maybe about yourself, and maybe it's about yourself, maybe it's about the other person, the disclosure of things that were previously hidden or beneath the surface, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm gonna have a play with that. As you know, I like a good Venus retrograde. I don't, but I find it compelling from like a journeying and ceremony perspective.
They're compelling.
Yeah.
I will say that they're emotionally engaging.
Yes. Yeah, that's the retrograde.
Speaking of which, you can see my light levels keep dimming as the sun is is descending in the west. 1 second.
These metaphors write themselves.
No, there's no light in here.
No, that's cool. We need to wind up anyway, so because we've kept you long enough. But I guess I just wanted to pull some of this together and go back to, at least from my side, and then I'll throw it over to you. Allow this moment to transform you. And in terms of like action items, which is in fact a pre-transformation thing to do, fill up on joy, like take every opportunity to fill up on joy, fill those camel humps with joy. And when I want to come back to that Charles Eisenstein thing about it, not about what you can do, but where you can do something. There's the opportunity. You will know you are going through that transformation when you are thinking in that way, when you're operating at the level of the field through this, right? So allow this moment to transform you, fill up on joy, not what can we do about it, but where can you do something? What do you think, Austin? What are we going to leave people with?
It sounds good. I mean, I don't know about the how so much. The timing is a little easier for me. Yeah. One thing I would say that I think is practical with timing is observe what areas of your life, if any, are caught up in the events of July, and take lessons from that, right? Because that's stuff Saturn and Uranus is working on, has been working on, and will continue to be working on for a while, right? And that's look for Saturn, like areas where you're trying to maintain security and control and stability, and how those are in conflict with either like surprising events that throw those into crisis, or like a sort of brewing rebellion where you're like, I gotta start doing something differently in this area of my life. Like that's kind of what it looks like on an individual level. But keep an eye on that in July. And then think, okay, so I have until November to make some upgrades.
I like it. That's really
because all this stuff comes up again in November.
Yeah. And also that's really good to leave people with, because it's not just in November that it comes up. It's the good side of July is that you'll see like, I see this is going to be with me for a while.
Yeah, that's kind of where let July kind of help locate the project.
Yeah, very good. Well, sir, I mean, we talk all the time, so I'm going to say see you in 6 months, but see you in 6 months. Buckle up, everyone.
See you. It'll be really interesting to recap.
Yeah, well, God. And thank you everyone for the excellent questions and for the dynamic chat that's been going on as it happened. Always a pleasure. And yeah, have a good one, everyone.
Always fun. Yeah. Take care, everybody. Bye.